Sunday this August, we have been moving deeper into one of the most familiar stories that Jesus has ever told. It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, a man was traveling the 17-mile stretch of road between Jerusalem and Jericho when he was attacked by thieves, robbed, beaten, and left for dead alongside the road. Well, by chance, there were 3 other people who were also traveling on the road that same day. The first 2 saw the injured man and went out of their way to avoid any kind of contact with him, and he would have surely died if not for another man, a third man, a Samaritan man, who came up alongside close to the man, got off his donkey, delayed his own plans, put himself at risk, helped the wounded man to safety, and provided whatever resources the man needed to be whole again. And we've learned the moral of the story, haven't we? It's get off your donkey. Now, in my planning of this series, I thought it would be fun to get some photos of me riding a donkey. I thought it would be the perfect introduction to this series, but as you can see, the screen has not been set up. I actually called around and I asked around if anybody had a donkey that I could actually ride, but even Liz in the office put it out on Facebook, but it was just met with a lot of laughter and some smart remarks. I'd like to see that was one of the terms I heard over and over again, and even though I received some tips, it never seemed to really come to fruition. So one morning during my travels back and forth to Rochester and Minneapolis, I stopped and I spoke to my friend Steve Richards, the pastor from Messiah UMC, and I told him what I was trying to do. And he told me of his adventure with Chico Marylegs, a donkey that lived at a farm of a parishioner of the church that he himself attempted to ride just this past year. Steve said that as far as Brad, who was the owner, knew, Chico Marylegs had never been ridden by anybody. And as it turned out, Steve would not be the first to do so. I mean, he climbed over the fence in the pen, and the donkey ran as far as he could away from him. And he even got a little red cup filled with some of his favorite treats. And even then, he was a little bit skittish. And I mean, maybe he said maybe they could get a rope and tie it around his neck, and he could at least lead him around a little bit. But Chico Marylegs just wouldn't cooperate. He was very suspicious. And it turned out, eventually, after a long time, a lot of treats and a little bit of talking and very soft talking and moving very slowly in the right direction, he was able to get close. Just close enough to touch him. But it was only because Brad was actually blocking the exit. It turned out that there was absolutely no way that he would ever get to ride Chico Marylegs, because you see, Chico Marylegs is a rescue donkey. He was found wandering alongside the edge of the road in Kansas, and he'd been abused and not been given enough food to eat for a very long time. And if it hadn't been for Brad and Amy, his wife, who adopted him, he wouldn't be alive today. They adopted him and brought him home, and they fed him and nursed him back to health. And now Chico Marylegs, a name that was given to him by Amy's niece, now Chico Marylegs lives in a pen with Patrick, a 19-year-old horse who is now too old to be ridden by anyone. And what they've discovered is that the donkey has a calming influence on the horse. You see where this is going? You see, the only one who had been wounded has now become the companion for somebody else. And we've got a term for this. It's called wounded healer. And in the parable that Jesus told, the Samaritan had been wounded throughout his life. You are not good enough, Mr. Samaritan man. You are not one of us. You do not belong here. You are not loved. You are a foreigner. You follow a perverted form of Jewish faith. You are what's wrong with people who are not born Jewish and are not one of God's chosen people of Israel. A lifetime of being wounded. And yet he was the only one to get off his donkey, literally and figuratively, to bring healing to somebody else who had been left for dead alongside the road. He's the wounded healer, you see. Well, what about each of you? Do you have any scars? They may be physical or emotional or even spiritual. I mean, we all have scars. I know I do. And the older we get, the more scars we tend to accumulate. And every scar lets us tell a story. You see, every scar is a mark of experience. And experience can be a wonderful thing. It is evidence of hurts and pain and suffering and loss and brokenness. And even when the wound is healed, the scar remains. In fact, I think the scar is there to remind us that we have been healed for a purpose. You see, the wounds and the scars are not an indication of what we cannot do. In fact, it's just the opposite. Sometimes the very best way to find healing for ourselves is to get involved in bringing healing to somebody else. In our scripture this morning out of the Gospel of Luke, the religious expert wants to know how to secure life in the hereafter. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is less concerned about getting people into heaven as he is getting heaven into people. And so the religious expert ends up answering his own question with the words that we've come to know as the Great Commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The key word here, folks, the action word, the verb in those verses is love. Do you want to find life? It's love. I'm not talking about a feeling this morning. It's an action word. I believe that is what church is all about. It's the Good Samaritan story, not loving God, loving each other, loving the world, because that's what followers of Jesus do. This world needs more Jesus. And the more we keep our sight, the more we keep our eye on Jesus, the more we get everything else. Now, sometimes we don't move. We don't get off our donkey because we don't know. I mean, it's like a game of chess. We can sit there and stare at a chessboard and think about a strategy to move a piece and the way it ought to be moved so that we can win the game. And we just sit there and think about all the possible moves and rules of the game, like the knight, the guy on the horse, just move them up to and one over. When I think that Jesus wants, just for us, it is for every piece to just move one step forward, just one square forward, closer to Jesus. If you don't know what to do, just take a step closer. Because ultimately, Jesus wants the whole board. He wants the whole world. Steve also told me a story about when he went to church on a Sunday a couple of years ago when he was in Kenya. And somehow the word got out that he was a pastor. And he just wanted to be incognito, but the word got out. And as he walked out of the church, the actual pastor said to him, "You will preach next Sunday." Now, he didn't want to do it. And when he tried to get out of doing what he didn't want to do, he was told that it's already been announced he's preaching. Everybody's expecting you. So what would he preach about, he said. It felt like he was staring at the chessboard. What could he, a Mzungu from a middle-class America, have to say to people in Nanyuki, Kenya, who were just trying to get by and living on the edge? And then it came to him. Just tell them he's got the whole world in his hands. And if we can love as Jesus loved, there's no end to what God can do through each of them. If you don't know what to do, just get closer to Jesus. Just take that step. You see, the Samaritan man on the donkey was on the edge of risk. I mean, this stretch of road from Jerusalem to Jericho was known as the Red or Blood Road because it was so dangerous. So people were attacked and wounded and lost their lives alongside that road. And if that's where people get hurt, And if you are on a road that's dangerous, do we even bother getting off our donkeys? No. You know, as I was writing this sermon, I had the idea that maybe we should name the part of our parking lot that actually goes out to the road, out the doors of the street, we should name that the Jericho Road. Because when we walk outside these doors, we are called to take a risk. I mean, we're called to walk outside and dismount. You see, most of us live in the midst of being comfortable. And if you live in the midst of being comfortable, how often do you really need what Jesus has to offer? I mean, really. In July, I went to a benefit for a ministry in Kenya that I support, and I visited with a woman named Mama Maggie, who was here to speak at the benefit. And in Kenya, a mother takes on the name of her oldest child, and in Mama Maggie's case, she had just one child, Maggie. And when Maggie was just 4 months old, she had contracted meningitis. And it got so bad that her husband left, and he never returned. Maggie is now 12 years old. She can't walk, and she can't talk. The most basic of tasks are impossible for Maggie. Every morning, Mama Maggie gets up, gets her daughter cleaned up and fed, and then she ties Maggie to her back. And she walks for an hour uphill alongside a dirt road on her way to Heshima Children's Center, where Maggie will receive physical therapy and speech therapy. And she also provides Mama Maggie a job making jewelry. When I met with Mama Maggie and listened to her story, I asked her, "How can I pray for you?" And she said, "Will you pray for my daughter to walk?" Now, she's never been able to walk. She's 12 years old, and she's never taken a single step in her life. Pray for Maggie to be able to walk, because she is getting so heavy for me to carry her, and if we can't get to Heshima, I have nothing else. Now, I wanted to do something, but I could not offer to move to Kenya and start carrying Maggie for her. And even if I could buy her a car, there was no way she'd be able to keep it or maintain it. And the only thing I could do was to get off my donkey, dismount, and pray. And I have to tell you, I prayed a prayer like I've never prayed a prayer before, and every day since, I've been praying this prayer because Mama Maggie was absolutely confident that if I prayed and kept praying, God would answer her prayer. It's only a matter of time. Because she's got nothing else. She has no other option than to lean wholly and completely on Jesus. And in support of Mama Maggie, I've actually purchased several pieces of the Heshima jewelry myself that I give away as gifts. And if anybody wants to know about that, I'll tell you that later. But it's beautiful jewelry. You know, it's our job. Our job is to dismount, to take a risk, to get out on the edge, and if we don't know what to do, then find someone else who is out on that edge and come up alongside them. Just move closer to Jesus. That's why I became a pastor. At first, it was because I remembered the church where my parents took me when I was very young. Our family went to the Methodist church, but later I found out that there's a lot of options out there, that most people don't take any of them. And so after a while, neither did I. So in the past 10 years, I found my way back to church, and I began reading about John Wesley, this 18th century founder of the Methodist movement. And there was something about him that was so compelling to me about how he brought together two aspects of the gospel that were so often left completely separate. Wesley said that faith and works belong together. The social gospel and the evangelical gospel belong together. In fact, they cannot be taken apart. I mean, we cannot say that we love one another if we are not loving God. And we cannot love God unless we are loving one another. These two things, they're inseparable. Both are bound together. One is not possible without the other. And when I arrived here at Federated Church, I found that both the Methodist and UCC traditions can be found at the intersection of God's love and a hurting world. In fact, that's what happened in June when Brent Gosman and a few of our youth went to Urban Cross and served people of St. Paul. I mean, that's the intersection of God's love and a hurting world. And when our confirmation students hosted a movie night for the children of the community, another intersection. And when we help out serving the community by handing out groceries to those in need, our 2-hour delay cafes, or collecting school supplies, or countless other ways that this church reaches out, they are all intersections of God's love and a hurting world. And to help us live this way, Wesley established 3 general rules. I'm sure you've heard them. These 3 rules were meant to be so simple that everyone can remember them. And if you can remember them, you might live this way. And if you live this way, you're moving closer to Jesus. And the first rule, do no harm. So when we wake up in the morning, our first thought should be, I will do no harm. I will avoid evil of any kind in every place. And anything that I know would hurt someone else or to be offensive to God. I will do no harm. I wonder if this isn't one of our greatest struggles today. How to be respectful, loving, and agreeable, even when we disagree. Folks, what I've discovered is that being right is highly overrated. There's something better, and that is being humble. It's pointing to Jesus. And yet we live in a world that we're being taught that you have to just be angry, that you just tear other people down, and that's how you get what you want. I mean, just let everyone know how angry you really are. Try to be as offensive as you can, and you're going to get what you want. Push everybody away, and you win. But I think there's a better way. Be humble, and just point to Jesus, and get up close to somebody, and just love them. I mean, think about the most offensive person that you know, the most disagreeable person that you know, and just get up close next to them. Don't judge them. Don't point your finger at them. Just love them. Do no harm. And Wesley's second rule is do good to all. I mean, Wesley said it this way, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways that you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long ever as you can. And I think that pretty well covers it. It sounds simple. But to seek good for everyone in every act, with every word that we speak, the only way that's going to be possible is when we are guided always and everywhere, getting up close to God's kind of love. And that leads to the third rule. Stay in love with God. And it's going to take certain practices for us to stay in love with God. It's not unlike marriage. I mean, how do you stay in love with each other? It wouldn't work if one person said to the other, you know that I love you. After all, I married you, didn't I? How long would that marriage last if one never did anything to build up that relationship? It's going to take certain practices to build up that relationship, to stay in love with each other. It's like committing yourselves to spending time together and communicating and talking to each other. And it's a commitment to practicing daily acts of service towards each other. And so it is with God. Do no harm, do good to all, and stay in love with God. Do you think you can remember those 3 things? You see, when we are acting like the church, it changes everything. I mean, we are what God's love is supposed to look like. And if you're not sure about that, take a step closer to Jesus. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. You see, everybody deserves to know how much Jesus cares for them and that kind of life that Jesus has to offer. Are we paying attention? Do we know how you want to be remembered? I hope it's how you loved one another. God will do what God can do. Our job is to dismount, take a risk, and love. Let's pray. God, we are grateful that you have never given up on us, that you offer us the kind of love that will never fail. God, use us. Use our story, how you've been at work in us to tell a world in need that there is life. Lord, use us. Use us. In Jesus' name, amen.